I am watching Uganda today not with surprise but with clarity. The election has ended. Yoweri Museveni has been declared the winner again. Another vote, another confirmation, another chapter added to a long story Africa already knows. This is not about Uganda alone. This is about repetition. Across our continent, elections are held, results are announced, and power remains exactly where it was before the ballots were printed. The process looks democratic, the outcome feels permanent, and the youth are told to wait again for the next cycle. When I look at Uganda's election, I do not see chaos, I see structure. I see a system that has learned how to survive pressure by absorbing it. Internet shutdowns, state machinery, familiar opposition struggles, familiar international silence. Many will ask, why speak now? Because patterns are dangerous when we stop naming them. In Burkina Faso, our path did not begin with approval. It began with refusal. Refusal to accept that time alone creates legitimacy. Refusal to believe that stability without sovereignty is progress. Uganda's election did not shock Africa. What should shock us is how normal this has become. Today is not about judging Ugandans. It is about questioning a political model that keeps repeating itself while Africa's future waits outside the door. When leaders win again and again, the world calls it experience. Inside Africa, many are told it is stability. But I have learned that continuity can become a shelter where deeper problems hide, untouched and unchallenged. Uganda's election followed a familiar script: a long-serving president, an opposition that mobilized youth energy, a state that controlled the tempo of the process. The result was announced and Africa nodded, because it has seen this movie before. What matters is not whether ballots were cast, but whether power was ever truly at risk. Across the continent, electoral systems have grown sophisticated. They are no longer crude, they are managed, institutions exist, courts function, observers arrive, statements are released. But behind this structure, the same question remains unanswered: can leadership change without permission from the very system it threatens? This is where the pattern becomes clear. When a leader remains in power for decades, governance shifts from serving the people to maintaining balance between external partners, security forces, and political survival. Development becomes measured not by transformation, but by avoidance of collapse. Youth unemployment remains high, resource extraction continues, dependency is managed, not broken. I do not say this to dismiss elections, I say it to expose the limits of elections when they operate inside inherited frameworks. Voting inside a closed system does not open the system, it reinforces it. Uganda is not unique, it is recognizable. From Central Africa to East Africa, long rule has been normalized through procedure. The people vote, but the structure decides how far that vote can travel. In Burkina Faso, we reached a moment where waiting for rotation inside that structure was no longer an option. Insecurity was expanding, sovereignty was shrinking, our future was being negotiated without us. So when I look at Uganda today, I do not see failure. I see a warning, a reminder that continuity, when unexamined, slowly replaces accountability. And when accountability fades, legitimacy becomes a performance, not a relationship. This is the pattern I am reacting to. Not a man, not a country, a system that has learned how to repeat itself while calling it progress. Every election season across Africa carries the same image. Young people line the streets, phones raised, music loud, hope visible. They campaign, they volunteer, they defend their vote with passion, and then, when results are announced, that energy has nowhere to go. This is not because African youth lack numbers, they are the majority. In many countries, more than 60% of the population is under 30. This is not because they lack awareness, they are more informed, more connected, and more politically conscious than any generation before them. The problem is structural. The door they are knocking on was not designed to open. In Uganda, as in many states with long-serving leadership, youth participation is encouraged only up to a point. Mobilize, but do not disrupt. Vote, but do not threaten continuity. Protest, but within boundaries defined by the same power you are challenging. The system absorbs youthful pressure without transferring real authority. This creates a dangerous contradiction. Young people are asked to believe in democratic rituals while being excluded from democratic outcomes. Over time, this gap breeds frustration. First, it becomes apathy, then anger, then rupture. I have watched this pattern repeat across borders. Youth movements rise around charismatic opposition figures, but those figures are constrained by institutions shaped long before they arrived. Even when elections are competitive, the cost of truly winning becomes so high that the system protects itself before it allows renewal. This is why some leaders fear youth more than foreign critics. Youth do not negotiate in old language. They do not owe loyalty to Cold War alliances or donor frameworks. They measure legitimacy by results, not history. In Burkina Faso, the youth did not wait because waiting had already cost too much. Insecurity expanded while patience was preached. Resources left the ground while hope was exported in speeches. The system asked for more time, the people ran out of it. Uganda's election reminds Africa of this unresolved tension. A young population living under political arrangements built for another era. Elections offer expression but not transfer, participation but not power. This imbalance cannot hold forever. History shows us that when generations are locked out long enough, they stop asking for keys and start questioning the door itself. That is why today's elections must be read carefully, not for who won, but for who is still waiting. When elections end in Africa, the fastest reactions rarely come from the streets. They come from abroad. Carefully worded statements, measured congratulations, calls for calm, support for institutions. The language is consistent even when the outcomes are predictable. This is where the pattern deepens. International partners say they support democracy, but in practice they prioritize reliability. They look for governments that keep borders predictable, security cooperation intact, and economic agreements uninterrupted. Long-serving leaders understand this logic well. They present themselves as anchors in uncertain regions. In return, pressure softens. Uganda has played this role for years. A strategic security partner, a contributor to regional military operations, a stable ally in a volatile neighborhood. When elections arrive, these relationships do not disappear. They shape how far criticism goes and where it stops. This is not unique to Uganda. Across Africa, leaders who align with external security and economic interests are granted tolerance. Elections are observed, not challenged. Concerns are noted, not enforced. The system protects continuity while maintaining the appearance of democratic endorsement. This creates a quiet contradiction. African governments are judged less by how accountable they are to their people and more by how dependable they are to external partners. Stability becomes a currency. Longevity becomes reassurance. For young Africans watching, this reality is impossible to ignore. They hear speeches about democracy while seeing the same leaders reinforced year after year. They are told change is possible, but only within limits already agreed upon elsewhere. In Burkina Faso, we confronted this contradiction directly. We saw that dependency was being stabilized, not resolved. Security partnerships expanded while insecurity worsened. Aid arrived while sovereignty shrank. The language of reform was used to delay real decisions. When I speak about Uganda's election today, this is what I am reacting to. Not a single result, but an international environment that rewards permanence and calls it order. Africa must ask itself an uncomfortable question. If elections change nothing fundamental and international pressure protects continuity, where does accountability truly live? This question is not dangerous. Avoiding it is. Because when people realize that legitimacy is being negotiated above their heads, faith in systems collapses, and when faith collapses, politics moves out of conference rooms and back into the streets. That is not a threat, it is history. Many in the world see military interventions in Africa and call them anomalies. They speak of coups as exceptions, disruptions, or failures. I do not see them that way. I see them as inevitable consequences of a pattern where continuity is preserved at the cost of accountability. When political structures repeatedly absorb pressure without delivering meaningful change, a vacuum forms. It is not a vacuum of leadership, but a vacuum of legitimacy. People no longer feel their votes matter, their voices are heard, or their institutions protect them. In such conditions, force becomes a language to express the frustration of generations waiting at the door. Burkina Faso's path is often misinterpreted abroad. Observers see military action and cry instability. What they miss is the underlying cause, a system where elections and procedures failed to deliver results for the people, where dependency was normalized and where sovereignty was gradually eroded. Intervention became a necessity, not a whim. Uganda today fits into the same narrative of repetition. Young people mobilized, voices raised, hopes high, yet the structure remained impermeable. No external criticism, no internal challenge could shift the trajectory. The pattern continues and its rhythm is recognizable across the continent. Frustration, containment, superficial legitimacy, and eventual rupture elsewhere. This is not to glorify force or dismiss peaceful politics. It is to recognize that systems matter more than ceremonies. When legitimacy is performance, patience wears thin. When accountability is optional, youth begin to question every channel that was supposed to empower them. If Africa's future depends solely on elections designed to protect continuity, then the continent risks waiting for centuries for change that will never arrive naturally. And those waiting generations will eventually redefine the rules themselves, whether the world approves or not. Today, as I observe Uganda's election, I do not celebrate or condemn. I analyze. I see the pattern. And I speak because recognizing patterns is the first step to breaking them. Africa's hope does not live in statements, reports, or procedural applause. It lives in its people. It lives in the youth who refuse to accept repetition as destiny. It lives in those who watch the cycle unfold and ask, why does nothing change? Across the continent, youth are no longer passive observers. They are connected, informed, and aware that the old frameworks serve continuity more than progress. They see through controlled elections, carefully timed reforms, and temporary concessions, and they ask, what can we do differently? The diaspora is part of this force as well. Those living abroad carry knowledge, experience, and perspective, and they maintain a voice that cannot be silenced by national borders. They pressure institutions, amplify stories, and support movements that challenge stagnation. When combined with the energy on the ground, diaspora networks become a multiplier for legitimacy, strategy, and accountability. In Burkina Faso, we chose a path that directly confronted the limits of the system. We acted not out of ambition, but out of necessity, because waiting for permission to act had already cost lives, sovereignty, and opportunity. Change was urgent, and delay was dangerous. Uganda's election is a reminder. Elections alone cannot create change. Structures that protect long rule will always find a way to absorb pressure. Youth energy without channels for power, diaspora insight without influence, and activism without strategy can be powerful, but also constrained. This is why Africa must explore alternative models for legitimacy. Leadership is not granted solely through ballots. It is earned through action, vision, and alignment with the people's lived realities. We must rethink how accountability, trust, and sovereignty are cultivated, not only within borders, but across the continent as a whole. Patterns exist. Systems entrench themselves. But where there is clarity, courage, and collective resolve, these patterns can be challenged, and new possibilities emerge. Today, Uganda's election is another lesson in that ongoing struggle. Africa cannot afford to be comfortable with repetition. The same faces, the same outcomes, the same cycles repeated under the banner of democracy may look stable, but stability without sovereignty is not progress. When I see Uganda today, I see a system perfected at repeating itself, absorbing pressure while projecting legitimacy. And I cannot remain silent. The lesson is clear. Waiting for change to trickle down through familiar structures will never be enough. Power will always protect itself. Long-serving leaders, entrenched institutions, and international partnerships create a framework where disruption is discouraged and continuity rewarded. Elections become rituals, not instruments of transformation. But Africa is not powerless. Every time the youth rise, every time the diaspora voices dissent, and every time a leadership model chooses principle over approval, the narrative shifts. Change is not granted, it is claimed. And it begins with recognizing the patterns that bind us. Burkina Faso's experience shows that refusing to accept an imposed status quo is not chaos, it is courage. It is a declaration that sovereignty, accountability, and dignity cannot be outsourced or postponed. It is a reminder that leadership is defined not by tenure or recognition, but by alignment with the people and the courage to act when action is required. Uganda's election is not the end of the story. It is a mirror, a reflection of what Africa has tolerated, and a prompt to ask what kind of continent we want to be. Are we waiting for continuity, or are we demanding transformation? Are we accepting appearances, or are we claiming reality? I speak not to condemn, but to challenge, to name patterns, to inspire clarity, to call Africa to recognize that legitimacy is not inherited, it is earned. And when earned through courage, principle, and vision, it cannot be contained by elections, boundaries, or entrenched systems. The future of Africa will be written by those who refuse to follow repetition, and today the mirror has been held up once again. As I step back from today's events in Uganda, I am reminded that Africa's challenges are not born overnight. They are cultivated over decades of systems designed to preserve themselves while the people wait. Elections may come and go, leaders may change in name, but patterns endure. Recognizing these patterns is not pessimism, it is preparation. It is clarity about what must be addressed if the continent is to realize its potential. The true work of leadership is not in celebrating the predictable or managing appearances. It is in confronting structures that hinder progress, in listening to the voices long silenced, and in forging legitimacy that comes from the people, not permission. The youth, the diaspora, and every African who refuses complacency are the lifeblood of this change. They are the ones who will challenge repetition, question authority, and demand accountability where it has been absent. Uganda's election today is more than a result. It is a reflection, a warning, and an opportunity. It tells us that continuity alone is not victory, and that courage, vision, and action define true leadership. Africa must learn to read its own patterns, to recognize where legitimacy is performance, and to act when the system fails the people. Because the future will belong not to those who wait, but to those who dare to reshape it.